thank you for joining us today for Conversations with Iris. Today we're going to be talking about the impact Corona is having on LGBTIQ plus people seeking asylum in the UK and the work that the UK LGIG is doing during this global pandemic.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Laurie. I am one of the LGBTQI plus asylum support workers at UKLGIG, bit of a mouthful. I identify as queer and trans non-binary, and I use the pronouns they and them. UKLGIG stands for UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group. The name, unfortunately, is a bit misleading at the moment, although we are hopefully changing the name shortly. It doesn't necessarily cover at the moment the full range of people that we support. So we provide free legal advice on the asylum system, including how to prepare for Home Office interviews, how to prepare witness statements and evidence. We help people who are vulnerable or have complex cases with finding lawyers and legal aid representatives. We also provide peer-to-peer advice to lawyers representing LGBTQI plus people if they need a second opinion. And we offer practical casework support on things like accessing safe housing, financial support and healthcare. We run support groups, as well as providing one-to-one emotional support, including to people who are being held in immigration detention in the UK. At the most extreme end, we can be the people that many of our service users call when if they're actively planning suicide. We've taken calls from people who've locked themselves in a cupboard with a knife in their hand and saying that the only thing that's stopping them from taking their own life is talking to us in that moment. And for those people, we might be all that they have. So my sort of role within that is to run some support groups, I do one-to-one casework and provide emotional support. I run sort of training and information workshops for other organisations, and I write support letters and give evidence in court in cases where that's relevant.
So as a frontline worker, you have a real insight into people's lives and what they're going through. And it's really helpful, of course, for us to get an idea of the real lived experience of people's lives, because often when we read policy papers or we look at statistics or we think about the political arguments, it's difficult to think about the individual lives of those people that are going through this process. Being able to put the sort of flesh on the bones and really bring it to life, I think, is really important for policymakers, but also for those people that are going to be going into frontline work. I'm based in university, so we work with trainee social workers, with medics, with teachers, with a whole range of people that are providing services. I think it's really important for them also to understand the issues that particular members of marginalised communities are experiencing. So could you perhaps talk a bit about the particular experience that LGBTIQ people face in the asylum system so that we get that insight?
Yeah, sure. So LGBTQI plus people who are seeking asylum, we face multiple layers of discrimination and are very marginalised in society, as well as facing poverty, racism, xenophobia, etc. in the UK. They're often cut off from communities, from their countries of origin, and rejected by members of their families because of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And among all asylum seekers, LGBTQI plus people are among those at the highest risk of poverty and destitution. Isolation is a really big problem, and a lot of our service users also struggle with depression and low self-esteem. Many people also struggle to have access to safe housing, with some preferring homelessness over housing situations where they face abuse and harassment. And some people have to live with family members where they have to remain in the closet. That's the case for quite a few of our service users, and I think that's been a particular challenge during COVID, where maybe the only access to support they have is our support group, and that's not really an option when they're sort of shared in a space which doesn't feel safe, and they don't feel able to be out. A really big issue facing many of our service users is the idea of having to provide evidence of sort of proving your sexual identity or your gender identity. So the asylum system already presents a lot of challenges for people who go through it, anyone who goes through it, but LGBTQI plus people face additional barriers because they have this hurdle of sort of having to prove their sexuality, their gender identity, etc., to the Home Office. So what proof means practically is that the Home Office asks for a sort of consistent account of self-realisation and past persecution, if there was any, if that's relevant in their case. But there are, in our experience, really unreasonable expectations, very fixed expectations based on stereotypes of what it is to be gay or lesbian or bisexual, trans, etc. For example, the Home Office usually expects people to have undertaken a sort of emotional journey in terms of their self-realisation, or that they've experienced an inner conflict being LGBTQI+, but coming from an oppressive country. So effectively, the Home Office is sort of raising the standard of proof. Detention is a really big issue facing, I mean, anyone who's claiming asylum, but particularly if you're LGBTQI+. I mean, it puts LGBTQI plus people in particular at particular risk of harassment and physical and verbal abuse. We have a lot of our service users that we've come into contact with that have been in detention have faced different kinds of abuse, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, from their own communities and from other communities in detention. It's really not a safe place for anyone to be in, but particularly if you're LGBTQI plus. And the UK is currently the only country in Europe which doesn't have a time limit for immigration detention. So in the UK, you can be sort of locked up in immigration detention indefinitely. And the sort of mental torture and stress that puts on a person is really well evidenced, and is something that we've definitely seen within our service users, within the people that we come into contact with. Also, just sort of practically being in immigration detention and trying to build a claim, trying to evidence the support for your asylum claim, trying to access the different types of sort of written evidence, different types of proof that you might need from inside detention, especially as we've said with the housing situation. If you're in a situation where you're not safe, you're not able to be out, you're not able to be open about your identity within that space, is incredibly difficult. Seeking asylum often means being put, as I've said, into a situation which is sort of similar to which they've fled. So being around people that are displaying different types of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, etc., and different attitudes and behaviours from which they have sort of sought protection. So they may face physical and sexual violence, and that's something that, as I've said, we've certainly come across with the people that we've come into contact with in detention. They might have to go into the closet as a result, or suffer from mental health issues, and in some cases physical health issues. Also, just practically, they have limited access to LGBTQ support services, as well as their own community. So something that we're experiencing a lot amongst people that are contacting us is people having a sort of sense of hopelessness due to being detained indefinitely. And homelessness is one of the markers for those that are at risk of suicide. And actually, many of the calls that we get from people that are suicidal are from detention centres. Just briefly, I'm monologuing, but just very briefly, another two quick things is sort of people not realising that they had an asylum claim, and also lack of representation and legal representation. So certainly in the UK, sort of right-wing and political representation of LGBTQI plus asylum claims tends to sort of present an image of a huge number of people making false claims. From our experience, the real issue is actually people not saying that they're LGBTQI plus when they are. So sexual and gender identity claims aren't specifically included as a category of grounds in the 1951 Refugee Convention. It was put together post the Second World War, and the idea of the sort of refugee looked very different then, and was very, very limited in scope. So whilst now in practice, many cases that are LGBTQI plus fit into the sort of membership of a particular social group category, that's not something that a lot of people know, and it's not something that's widely advertised by the Home Office or by the UK government. So what we experience is that people often have a really limited and a narrow understanding of what asylum is prior to contacting us. We get a lot of people that are contacting us that had no idea that was a grounds for a claim. And in many cases, they may have, as a consequence, either applied for asylum late or exhausted other avenues. They may have made an application based on another ground, tried to squeeze into, say, political ground or one of the other grounds, and or religious, for example, and not realised that they had a claim, a much stronger claim based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. And at that stage, that can cause problems later on down the line when they do tell the Home Office because that they're LGBTQI plus, because the Home Office is far less likely to believe them if that's a conversation that comes up later. And then just finally, as I said, lack of representation. So LGBTQI plus people in the asylum system will often be unrepresented, especially when they live in remote parts of the country where there's a lack of legal aid lawyers specialising in immigration or in asylum, let alone anyone who's experienced in dealing with LGBTQI plus asylum claims. So as I said earlier, part of what we do is try to hook people up where necessary, try to find representation for them with legal aid lawyers that are experienced in representing people in LGBTQI plus specific asylum claims, because it is very different, the type of support that you need and the type of claim that needs to be created.
That's a pretty comprehensive overview, but there were a couple of things that I picked up from reading some of the publications by UK LGIG, and one was this focus on housing. And of course, you've spoken a lot about detention, but even when people are moved into the community, into housing, they're not necessarily any safer. And I read that in many cases, adults are having to share bedrooms with other adults that they don't even know. So clearly that's a very intimate space where people are coming together and like you said, are potentially at risk, particularly if their identity comes to light and they're sharing a room, I suppose, with somebody who is feeling sort of particularly fiercely homophobic. And the other thing I realized is that in this shared housing, there's also sort of shared facilities like toilets. And that's a particular discussion that's going on at the moment, more generally in terms of LGBTIQ identities and who has access to what toilet and who feels safe using what toilet and who feels unsafe depending on who uses what toilet. So I was thinking that some of these kind of debates that are happening in more mainstream society are kind of reduced and really highly concentrated in the context where a person doesn't really have their liberation or many other options or choices. So how living that day-to-day experience confined with the very people you might have been wanting to flee potentially, or perhaps not, but potentially I can imagine really exacerbate the anxiety and the mental ill health, you know, the difficulties that already exist with being a person seeking asylum. And one of the other areas I read about was translation. Of course, when people are needing translation services and they're having to rely upon people from their own communities who have their language skills to translate their story. I wonder if you have much experience of where people have felt that they haven't necessarily been safe in the context of relying upon somebody who is there actually to support them as a translator or as an interpreter, but where they don't necessarily know if that person is carrying homophobic ideas or is genuinely able to support them in a way that best meets their needs.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've come across a lot, and it's something that we're trying to work out ways around in the work that we do, where we're trying to find interpreters that are trained, that are informed. We're trying to give other organisations information and training so that they can be better informed with their interpreting services, because it definitely is something that limits hugely the language of someone's asylum claim if they're claiming on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, etc.
And one of the other areas that I've sort of thought about more in terms of the conversations I've been having with people who are going through this process is their fear for the people they've left behind. Because when they have reached a place where they think they may find safety and refuge, they still feel unsafe about telling their full story because of the repercussions upon their mum back home. And of course, the reality is that in order for people to prove that they are lesbian, for example, they are having to speak out very publicly about their identity. It seems as if it's not enough just to say, I am a lesbian and this is my life. This needs to provide evidence, as you were talking about earlier, means that they have to somehow really put their life out there.
Many of our service users just feel like there's a lot of pressure for the way that they represent their LGBTQI plusness to be really different from, for example, how you or I would represent ourselves or how we would be expected to behave within our communities. And I often think that if I was pushed into a position where I was forced to prove my gender identity or my sexual orientation, I'm not sure how I would go about that.
Yeah, again, it means that they're having to live their very sort of personal lives out in the public in a way that hasn't felt safe in the past. And now we're asking them to do the very thing that they didn't feel safe doing before in order to access the chance to feel safe in the future. And that can be really re-traumatizing, of course. So thinking more now about this context that we're living in of this global pandemic and the movement of people during a global pandemic and the provision of services, are you able to say something about the further complications that LGBTIQ plus people might face as a result of the sort of further isolation or the further difficulties that we're experiencing during Corona?
Sure. So I guess some of them are more general things that are faced by anyone who's going through the asylum system, and then some of them are sort of specific to LGBTQI plus people, but they're all things that our service users, issues that our service users are facing. So firstly, the accommodation and the financial element of asylum support, of Home Office provision of support, have been quite drastically delayed. So what that means practically is that whilst in some cases people are being provided with sort of interim accommodation, that might be a hostel or a hotel or something where they're and they may be moved from place to place, there's not really the stability in that case, and often it's offered on a no choice basis. So account won't be taken of you being LGBTQI plus and being in a space which also has people who are queer. And it also means that people are waiting for months and months and months to wait to know where they're going to be dispersed to, and in some cases to also have the financial support in place that they need, which just practically is really, it's emotionally a huge amount to expect from someone in terms of the impact on people's physical and mental health, but it's also a huge impact on people's ability to be able to build up their case, sort of having that stability and knowing where you're going to be based, but also having access to those services are really, really important things for building up a case. Lots of the housing services that we would normally signpost to, so within our sort of service user group, that would include the Outside Project, a great LGBTQI plus service for people who are experiencing homelessness. Micro Rainbow, who have a sort of similar field of us, working with people who are refugees and asylum seekers who are LGBTQI plus, and Refugees at Home, which is a hosting organisation for anyone who's a refugee or seeking asylum in the UK. At the moment, they have at different points have had really long waiting lists, or have had to pause during lockdown because of specific restrictions, or not been taking referrals at all. And their services we work with really closely, and that are really specifically tailored towards the sorts of needs that our service users would have around housing. So them not being available has really, really intensely impacted sort of safety. It's a feeling of safety for many of our service users. Similarly, the mental health organisations we would often refer to have been increasingly overwhelmed with inquiries and referrals, as you can understand. Similar with physical health services. I would say that's particularly been the case for many of our trans service users who have not been able to access different types of healthcare support that they would need for their sort of emotional well-being, necessary healthcare for them, but also things that would be useful information for them to add potentially for their evidencing their claim. So that's got a really immediate impact. There've been loads of delays, and loads of services have been closed that are physical healthcare services because of COVID. I mean, many of the services that we would refer people to have been they're really busy at the best of times, but COVID's just meant that it's just had a huge increase in need because of the impact of the pandemic. Practically, in terms of people's asylum claims, there was a period where interviews were sort of effectively paused in the first few months of lockdown, and less decisions were being issued by the Home Office. Loads of our service users are experiencing really huge delays in their in waiting for their second interview, their substantive interview, or in waiting for a decision. One of our service users was waiting for a decision after a substantive interview for I think almost 3 years in the end. There were a couple of different delays, but it's a really, really long time to just be waiting to know what's going to happen. And appeal hearings are also effectively have been sort of postponed for later days, which if that's the sort of thing that you're pinning on, at least if I can work towards that, then I'll have some sort of decision, and then that's delayed, and you don't know when it's going to be reorganised for. That has a really huge effect. As a result, lots of our service users who reached out to us have needed sort of updates and advice specifically on this area, on how they're going to be impacted by that, and it's sort of increased their anxiety. So we've experienced a huge increase in demand for emotional support. I think it's about three times the amount of emotional support inquiries from prior to lockdown. There's also, I guess, relatedly, that been a really negative impact on the sort of well-being and, I guess, resilience available to many of our service users. Resilience is something that we work on a lot, and I think that's something we've probably all can relate to in COVID, is that the things that we would normally have access to, our resources that we would reach out to for resilience, haven't been available to us. And I think that's particularly the case with many of our service users, when in addition to these delays, they also don't have access to the LGBTQ plus specific support services and networks that they would have had access to prior to COVID. As I said, we're getting a lot more requests around emotional support. We're finding that practically in terms of people being able to build up their claims, if people don't have access to the same, as you said, evidencing their claims, social networks, physical support groups, events, socialising, healthcare services, sort of the things that we've touched on, some of the things that you might want to include as evidence towards your claim, and also their wellbeing spaces. that can lead to increased isolation. It can practically mean that it's much, much harder to evidence your claim. I think we've mentioned already people potentially being sort of trapped in housing situations as well, where they are forced to be in the closet. And I think that's particularly been the case during COVID. A lot of our service users were sort of in between, we're about to move to a different space, and then that's been put on hold due to COVID. So we've sort of been trying to manage providing support for them, but in a space, as I said, which isn't particularly safe for them. Yeah, as I said, we've had a threefold increase in people trying to access emotional support, and I think that's more so the case with people that are in detention, in immigration detention. We've actually had to recruit an extra member of staff to meet the demand that we've had for additional support, and we've been referring a lot more people to sort of counselling and therapeutic support services. We've also seen an increase in need for things like food, and other essential items, toiletry, sanitary products, and mobile top-ups. Lots of people needing to access the internet a lot more than was previously the case, and that isn't something which is possible really on the sort of £37 to £39 a week that you get with an asylum support budget. Yeah, and overall, I would say that we've just, people have needed a lot more contact from us and a lot more signposting to a wider range of organisations. Yeah.
And it's interesting what you say about the impact the general services and their lockdowns are having, because of course, when somebody is seeking asylum, they also want to live a full life. So although most of their energy is probably focused upon their asylum claim and wanting to have the right to remain, in the meantime, the importance of doing other things, social activities, meeting people, is crucial. It's crucial to everybody's mental health, and particularly to people that are so marginalised and isolated. So when LGBTIQ plus centres close down or go to remote working, again, their opportunity to sort of tap into those services and you know, create spaces for joy and celebration, not always just support services focusing on the claim, are lost to them, particularly if they don't have access to internet and the data that would be required on their phone to be able to participate online in social activities. Obviously, if you're going to have a limited amount of data and you have to decide whether or not you're going to use that to get legal advice, or you're going to use that to have a sort of social activity online with other queer people, you know, that those judgments need to be made, and they're difficult ones. So we've, based upon your experience, the research that organisations like yours does, and the sort of frontline services that you provide, what recommendations would you like to give to policymakers, to frontline workers, maybe to students thinking about going into working in areas where they will be or may potentially be providing services to LGBTIQ people who are seeking asylum? You know, what advice, what recommendations would you give?
So a lot of our sort of research and our policy work focuses on, I mean, it all focuses on improving the system, the immigration system, the asylum system for LGBTQI plus people, and sort of practical measures that can be made with that is firstly to apply the correct standard of proof. So as we sort of discussed briefly earlier, the Home Office should be assessing whether there's a reasonable likelihood that someone would be harmed if they return to their country of origin. And as I said earlier, that's a much lower than the threshold in criminal law, where you have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And what we're finding is that that's often not the case, and the correct standard of proof isn't being applied. So that's a really easy sort of first step, really measurable. Then, as I also touched on earlier, stop stereotyping LGBTQI plus people. We are a diverse group of people. And for many people, sexual and gender identity isn't a sort of identity or something you are. It can, for example, it can be a behaviour. And there are many ways of understanding and experiencing or sort of conceptualising sexual and gender identity. yeah, we're not sort of single-minded group. The Home Office needs to stop expecting all LGBTQI plus people to have experienced particular emotions or a particular experience. As I said, we're very diverse. Yeah. Number 3, end detention. Just in general, but really specifically, obviously, because we're an LGBTQI plus organisation, we're looking at how LGBTQI plus people are particularly impacted in detention. But yes, end detention. And then give people a choice about where they live and what kind of accommodation they're in. As I've said, specifically in many cases, that might mean people being in LGBTQI plus specific accommodation, or many of our service users are finding that, for example, living in cities or in larger cities where there is an LGBTQI plus population is much better for their mental well-being, and it's also much better for the likelihood of their claim succeeding, because they're more able to access the services that would and groups that would help them in their claim in loads of different ways, emotionally and practically, in writing support letters, etc. And then there's some important points as well for policy which aren't specifically based at LGBTQI plus people, and they are they're just being more access to legal aid. So with the Legal Aid and Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, it reduced the access to legal aid. So just being able to provide more legal aid for more cases and in more situations will mean that more people have a fairer right to be able to effectively represent their asylum claim. And also supporting people with the right to work. At the moment, many of our service users, even after they're sort of past the threshold point of 1 year where they're able to see if they're able to lift the prevention of them being able to have the right to work, they're often being given a sort of a very reduced right to access. So they're being given the right to work in jobs that are really specialist, things like a very highly qualified chef, or a ballerina, or a paramedic or a doctor. Things which are professions that we really need in the UK, but that aren't realistic for a lot of people to have qualifications in. So just give people the right to work, give them something to do, give them the ability to be able to contribute in a way that feels meaningful for them to living in this society that they choose to live in the UK, and for us to be able to learn and grow from working with them. I think that covers most of the policy recommendations that we've come on, but as I said, please have a look through our publications, because they go into things in a lot more detail.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for your time. You've offered some really important insights, and we'll add, like you said, some links to the papers and to resources below this recording. And I know that one of the recommendations you've mentioned is resources, obviously providing resources so that services can be provided, so that people can access the kind of support they need. So we have also agreed to put a link to the UK LGIG website below, so that if people are wanting to donate to your organisation, they can. But I think it's also about encouraging people to have these conversations and to raise awareness, and to provide support and community for people who are incredibly marginalised in our societies. Thank you very much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.